Hey everyone, back again, chapter 6 today. Miles Morales, Spider-Man. I just got done recording part 2 of chapter 5, but I have to act like, it was a completely different day to make this video. I mean, not a different day, same hoodie I was just wearing. Shout out to the WNBA. Keep doing your thing. All right, chapter 6. So we just got done. Miles skipped out on work, went to the poetry show, and then Alicia was like, "Hey, come," and he was about to give her his poem that he wrote to her, and then she was like, "Hey, why don't you read it to everybody?" And he got nervous, and one of his powers is to go camouflage mode, and that's what happened. So let us pick up from there. Chapter 6. The journey back across campus was long and lonely. Miles talked to himself the whole way. All you had to do was say no. There's nothing wrong with saying you're just a little shy. Or you could have just explained that you had written a poem for her. As he passed some of his fellow students, latecomers on their way to the open mic, snapped their necks to the side, chasing the voice of a person they couldn't see. Miles hadn't taken into account that he was still invisible. Once Miles got back to the store, before he could even open the door, he looked around to make sure no one was there to witness the door open. On its own. Once the coast was clear, Miles slipped back inside, back behind the register, back against the wall, where he climbed up, plugged the security camera back in, then reappeared just as he had planned. His shift was almost up, and he spent the rest of it running an imaginary conversation, line for line out loud between him and Alicia. No, I can't read this in front of everyone, because I wrote it for you. For me? Miles, you wrote this for me? Wow. Yeah, I'm not Langston Hughes, or nobody like that, but I hope you like it. Oh, Miles, I love it. It's beautiful. And once he caught himself, he waggled his head, shook his imaginary love story out, grabbed his backpack, and closed up shop. When he got back to the dorm, it was still empty. Miles figured out by now that Genki had probably read a poem and signed up for a self-imposed encore. Normally, Miles would use that time to unwind and take his mind off of everything by tuning it out and plugging in. Video games, Super Mario Brothers to be exact. But tonight, he chose torture instead. He sat on the edge of his bed, reached for his bag, and pulled out Austin's letter again, this time starting in the middle and reading it to the end. I'm 15, and as I'm sure you figured out by now, I'm locked up. Been in here for a while. I guess I have a while to go. I guess it's in my blood, at least on my dad's side. I'm not sure how well you knew my father. My grandma says, shout out to my wife in the background here. She's putting something in the microwave. I do not think she wants to make an appearance, so that's why she ran away. She just said, mm-mm. Shout out to her. Um, she's the best. All right. My grandma says the brothers didn't really get along and that they hadn't spoken in a long time. So that probably means you didn't really know him. Maybe, if you want, I could fill you in with some of that stuff. Tell you how he was. If you write back, I hope you do. Sincerely, Austin Davis. P.S. Sorry for the pencil. I know it's hard to read, but they won't let us use pen in here. It's the microwave going off. Hopefully it doesn't catch too much. There she is again, boys and girls, grabbing something from the microwave, and she's gone. Miles folded the letter once more, set it on his desk. Austin assumed Miles didn't know Aaron, that the rift between brothers kept them apart. But Miles knew him well, too well. He knew that the only reason he was Spider-Man was because of a spider in Aaron's house, stolen from the lab. He knew Aaron knew about his secret and tried to use it against him. He knew they fought, and that, because of him, Aaron was dead. And Austin didn't have a father anymore. You're just like me. Miles yanked a notebook from his bag again, flipped to a blank page, and started writing. Dear, scratch out. Austin, thanks for the letter. I have to tell you the truth. Scratch out. I'm a little surprised. I don't really know how else to say it. I'm just so shocked. First, I guess I should say it's nice to meet you, even though it's like this. Or maybe a better way to say it is it's good to know you exist. I had no idea. I don't know if your grandmother told you, but I'm an only child, and I always wished there was someone for me to hang with. I always wanted a brother. Not saying you're my brother or anything, but just that it's cool to know there's someone else in my family, in my age group. I wish I would have known. But the past is the past. Scratch out. But better late than never, right? Maybe we can just have a fresh start. Okay, some things about me. I'm 16. I'm from Brooklyn. I go to a bougie boarding school called the Brooklyn Visions Academy. I'm on scholarship, and my folks still can't afford it. A lot of rich kids acting like rich kids. I have a homeboy named Genki, Korean dude, hilarious. He's the closest thing I have to a brother. I think that's all I got. And I did know, scratch out, knew your father. Uncle Aaron and I were close for a long time. I used to have to sneak to see him because my dad wouldn't allow it. That's why I'm surprised he never mentioned you, even though I guess I shouldn't be, because he probably knew that if he told me, I'd want to meet you. And if we met and got close, eventually it would be harder to keep up the fact that we had this secret relationship. And then I would be in trouble with my dad. And so would Uncle Aaron. I'm not sure whether or not your grandmother knows about some of the epic fights between those two. Crazy. Anyways, I guess I have time. If you have time, write me back. This is gonna sound messed up, and I don't mean to sound messed up, but what's it like in there? Sincerely, Miles. P.S. Your father tried to kill me. Scratch out. Maybe someday I could come visit. Miles set the letter to the side. It was much easier to write than poetry, and lay back down in bed, waiting for Genki to come bursting in, a barrel of braggadocio. Braggadocio. Going on and on about how whatever poem he shared at the open mic turned into a quad fountain into the geyser, and everybody cried and clapped, and as water came misting down on them, or something like that. Blah blah blah. Miles wouldn't make it. He wouldn't be able to keep his eyes open long enough to laugh at Genki, which would then turn into Genki laughing at Miles once he found out that Miles punked out once again with Alicia. Because 5 minutes after Miles hit the pillow, he was asleep. Miles woke up drenched in sweat, his heart jackhammering and his muscles tight and strained, as if they'd become ice underneath his skin. The only thing he remembered from the nightmare was that there was a cat he had never seen before. Matted white fur, its tail split into multiple tails, all coiling like snakes. But Miles couldn't remember where he was and why the weird cat was there. Miles sat up, stretched the stiff out of his joints, rubbed his eyes until they adjusted to the sunlight. He tried to remember what or who else was in the dream. Was it Uncle Aaron? Maybe. Probably. He wasn't sure. He got up, crept past Genki, who had his covers yanked over his head, and went to the bathroom to brush his teeth and wash up. When Miles returned to the bedroom, Genki pulled up the blanket back from his face. What are you doing up so early? Miles asked. Not sleeping. A lot on my mind, Genki replied. You and me both. Miles grabbed his jeans off the back of his desk chair. What about you? What are you doing up? Genki asked. Then went straight into a yawn. I have to go to the store to get a stamp and envelope so I can mail this off. Miles picked up the letter off his desk. It's a letter to Austin. Genki nodded. And you sure you want to do that? I mean, what bad could it do? If he's telling the truth, I get to have a cousin. If he's lying, I get to be a friend to somebody locked down. And it only cost me $1. $1, huh? Yankee said, sitting up, clearing sleep from his throat. I'd argue it's cost a little more than that. You think maybe you're doing this because of what happened with Aaron? Miles dabbed deodorant under his arms. Then, without responding, he grabbed his black t-shirt from a drawer and pulled it over his head. He went to the mirror. White skid marks down the side of his shirt from the deodorant. Of course. Ugh. He licked the finger and started scrubbing the fabric clean. After that, he brushed his hair, rubbed the rubbed his thumbs across the stubble growing in around his hairline. Then he snatched a letter off of the desk, picked up his backpack from the floor. I gotta go. Miles was never outside that early, and he was surprised at how peaceful it was. The leaves on the trees were fading from green to reddish orange, like nature's new color scheme for army fatigue. There was a crispness in the air, a breeze causing a whir around him. It reminded him of early mornings in his neighborhood, before everyone and everything was awake, before the sirens, the bus motors, the old school soca blared from open windows. And as Miles walked across the campus to the store thinking about the disaster the day before, possibly the worst Monday of his life, he reveled in the peace. He reveled in the peace until he got to the store. The door was propped open, and the campus police were inside interrogating Winnie. Just so we're clear, you've had no customers this morning? Sir, I told you I came in a little while ago. I opened the door, did my usual inventory check to see what needed to be restocked because that's usually what I spend my time doing during my shift since nobody is shopping this early in the morning anyway. Winnie scratched her scalp through the silk scarf wrapped around her head. No one's shopping ever, Miles thought, but his snark was interrupted by the officers noticing him in the doorway. Son, no one's allowed in the store right now. It's under investigation. An officer, who looked too young to be balding, barked. He held up the halt hand. Halt. Investigation? Miles asked, his voice seesawing between concern and sarcasm. Miles' eyes shot from the officer to Winnie. Yeah, I came in and all the cans of sausage were gone. Like all of them. So I pulled up the inventory report because I couldn't believe we sold them, and I was right. There were no sausages sold, which means they were stolen. Or vanished, Miles said, now half nervous, half joking. The officer cut his eyes at Miles, cocked his head to the side, unamused. Wait. Winnie looked like she was connecting the dots to something. Dots that Miles had no clue needed connecting. Maybe y'all should talk to him, Winnie said, pointing at Miles and the officer. Miles, weren't you working last night? Yeah, Miles said, the words needling his throat. He glanced back at the young baldy, caught his steely eyes, and then looked away. But nothing happened. Oh, something happened, the officer said. Miles was perplexed, watching the young officer lick his chops. Nothing happened last night, at least nothing in the store, but something was happening now. Something bad. With a pen and pad at the ready, the officer started in on a string of questions, each one making Miles more and more nervous. What time did you get to work? 4. About how many customers would you say you had? None. Any suspicious behavior? From who? Did you ever leave the store for any reason? No answer. Did you ever leave the store for any reason? No. Did anyone look suspicious outside? I just told you I didn't leave the store. Just checking. What time did you leave? I didn't leave. I mean, when was your shift over? Around 7? Cool. If we have any more questions, we'll find you. After the officer left, Miles tried to remember if he noticed anything different about the store when he'd returned from the open mic. The truth was, he hadn't checked. Why would he? For one, his mind was on a bunch of other things. Alicia, Austin. Furthermore, the store didn't seem any different. Nothing was ever moved or rearranged. The notepads were all along the wall, the pens and pencils behind the register, the sausage in the back. The only reason Winnie did the inventory report was because she had to in order to keep her job, not because it made any sense. Miles racked his brain for a moment, standing smack in front of the counter, before Winnie finally snapped him out of it. Miles, she said, then repeated, Yo, Miles. Yeah? Miles blinked out of his daydream. Did you need something? Winnie was perched on her elbows, the same exact way Miles was the night before. like a yoga pose, bored, convenience store, worker pose. Oh, yeah, just a stamp in an envelope. Winnie turned around, ripped the stamp off the roll, and grabbed an envelope, slid both across the counter. Miles pulled a crumpled dollar out of his pocket. Thanks, he said, turning. What happened here last night? Winnie prodded. Like, for real, I ain't gonna say nothing. If you or Genki loves those nasty sausages. She shrugged like she knew Miles had taken them, even though he didn't. Winnie, you was Scolo, like me. You of all people know I wouldn't risk my scholarship for canned meat. True, she nodded. Well, it probably wouldn't be nothing. I mean, all those cans stolen only equals about $15. They can just bill you or your folks for that. I just had to report it because if I didn't, I know. Miles understood. I know. But he didn't know there would be a knock on Mr. Boehm's door halfway through calculus, and then Mr. Boehm would turn back to the class and call Miles's name. "A gentleman would like to see you," Mr. Boehm said. Always calculated. And when Miles stood, Mr. Boehm added, "You'll want to take your belongings." From there, Miles was escorted by a different campus police officer down the hall, out of the main building, across the campus, and into the admin building, where he was seated in a lounge outside the dean's office. The waiting room of discipline. Miles slumped in his chair amid a dark wood and burgundy leather until his mother and father showed up. "What's going on?" Miles's mother asked. Excuse me. Her face a knot of confusion. "I don't know," Miles said. "Did you do it?" his father asked. "Do what?" Miles furrowed his brow, narrowed his eyes. "Steal." "Steal? Of course not. They think I stole that stuff? What do you think we're—" Before Miles's father could finish preemptively scolding Miles, Miss Fletcher, the secretary, spoke with over to him. "The dean will see you now." 5 minutes later, Miles sat in Dean Kushner's office in front of a big wooden desk carved with ornate designs similar to the ones on the good china at Miles's parents' house. Dean Kushner was a small man and looked even smaller behind that desk. He had a perfectly round, pale, bald head, the veins in it like stitches in a brand new baseball. He wore small circle-framed glasses, of course, that were the exact size of his wide eyes. The guy was a mess of circles in a wool suit. Miles' parents sat on the other side of him, their faces twisted. Both of them twitched their legs nervously. For Miles, this was even more of a nightmare than the ones involving Uncle Aaron. At least those all ended with him waking up and snapping out of it. But this was real. He had only been back to school for one full day and had already teetering on another stretch of punishment. A much, much worse punishment. "Please read this aloud," Dean Kushner commanded, handing Miles a piece of paper. Miles glanced on the paper, gnawing his bottom lip. He sighed, glancing at Dean Kushner, then reluctantly cleared his throat and began. "Dear Dean Kushner, my name is Miles Morales. I'm a 13-year-old from Brooklyn, and I have an amazing mother and father who love me more than anything, which I know might seem strange for a teenager to admit, but I know what they've sacrificed for me and what they continue to sacrifice for me to stay on a direct path to success. And it's because of their guidance that I've maintained a 4.0 GPA in middle school. I've been taught how to be excellent, which is why I'm interested in attending Brooklyn Visions Academy, a school that also prides itself on excellence. But I also pride myself on honesty. And if I'm being honest, I have to mention that even though I have a great family, I know there are people who look at us a certain way. The reason why is because my father wasn't always the man he is today. He was a man who didn't have anyone to steer him away from the traps of our community. Even though my neighborhood is a beautiful place to grow up, sometimes it can get complicated. And my father and his brother fell victim to the street, becoming teenage thieves, bringing problems to our neighborhood and all of New York City. And even though my father, with the help of my mother, pulled himself out of the situation and cleaned up his life, his brother did not. My uncle continued to break the law, hurting people, until finally it caught up to him. That part of my family is also part of me. The same fearlessness that led them to a crime is what leads me to excellence. And my goal, if you give me the honor of attending Brooklyn Vision's Academy, is to continue to prove that. I believe it's not just where you're from, Dean Kushner, but also about where you're going. Thank you for your consideration, and I look forward to your reply. Sincerely, Miles Morales. Miles set the paper back on the desk, defeated. Now, Mr. Morales, Dean Kushner said, pushing his glasses up on the bridge of his nose. Is this or is this not the letter you submitted with your application to this institution? It is, sir, Miles said. And did you or did you not say that you wouldn't fall victim to the toxic patterns of your family? Excuse me, Dean Kushner, but I don't think that's... Miles' father interjected. I'm just paraphrasing what your son wrote, Mr. Davis. The dean tapped the paper. I understand that, sir, but, we understand that, sir. Miles' mom stepped in to massage the moment. But Miles said he didn't do it. I didn't. Why would I steal something from the store that I work at? And steal what, sausage? Dean Kushner, is there any proof? Miles' father asked, still fuming over the dean's accusations. Well, funny you should ask, Mr. Davis, because actually there's the footage from the surveillance. Footage? Miles' father cut his eyes at Miles. Footage? Miles wanted to breathe a sigh of relief because this evidence should have, in fact, cleared his name. But his muscles were still tight with confusion. There was no way he could have been on film stealing sausage because he didn't steal any sausage, right? So why was he still so nervous? That's right, Dean Kushner got up from his desk and opened a cabinet to the left of him, which housed a television. He grabbed the remote, powered on a monitor, and cut right to the scene of the crime. Here, Miles is in the store. Now you'll see he backs up until he's out of the camera shot for a few seconds, and then suddenly, he's back. The dean explained like the lawyer in a courtroom, drawing attention to Exhibit A. Okay, Miles' father said. Dean Kushner, this doesn't really show much, Mrs. Morales said. Ah, but it does. Dean Kushner almost sounded cheerful. Take a look at the timestamp. It jumps from 6:13 to 6:45. Now, I don't know how or why the camera cut out like that, but it would be silly to believe it was a coincidence. And quite frankly, if Miles didn't steal anything, surely he should know who did because he would have been standing right there. Dean Kushner tapped the TV screen. It only makes sense that somehow during the 30 minutes the camera was shut down, stocked up on sausage, Miles snapped. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He looked at his mother and father, their faces sour with uncertainty. Miles, his father said, just tell me you're not trying to protect anybody. If you didn't do this, then tell Dean Kushner who did. I don't know who did it. That's because you did it, the dean said matter-of-factly. Just tell us the truth, son. Miles's father drew a deep breath. His mom stepped in again. Sir, with all due respect, can you give us a moment? She turned to her son, lowered her voice as if she could somehow have a private conversation without Dean Kushner hearing. Miles, I didn't do it. Miles's head was swiveling back and forth between his parents. Why would I steal that stuff? Maybe to sell it in dorm, strip and flip, just like, no, that's not, I didn't. Miles pleaded. His father sighed. Miles, son, please. Dad, I really don't know who did it. He looked at his mother. Ma, his mother shook her head. Well, then I'm not sure what other choice we have, Dean Kushner said, pointing the remote at the TV, clicking it off. He picked up his personal statement Miles had submitted with his application, glanced at it again. As you wrote in your own words, you could have chosen to rise to excellence, the dean said, shaking his head. Miles's father clenched his jaw. Such potential to break the chain, he continued. Miles's father, now gripping his chair, tapped his foot more intensely. But unfortunately, it doesn't look like that will be happening. Excuse me. Dean Kushner let the paper fall from his hand. Wait. Miles spoke up. His parents perked up. Dean Kushner looked up. I left the store. I didn't steal anything. But I left for a few minutes. What? Miles's mother said. You did what? From his father. A childlike embarrassment washed over Miles, the kind he used to feel when he wet his bed when he was a kid. I just I just wanted to check out the open mic, so I cut the camera and left the store. Miles dropped his head dramatically, pressed his chin against his chest, and rocked back and forth, deflated. Miles's parents glanced at each other. Are you sure you're telling us the truth, son? Miles's father asked, his voice dipping into further suspicion. Miles lifted his face. Dad, I'm not lying. That's what happened, he said. His father nodded, then looked back at the dean. Well, Dean Kushner started. He rubbed his round jaw. Without further proof of who actually stole the items from the store, I suppose I can't expel you, son. Not this time. Miles's mother instantly relaxed her shoulders, relieved. Oh, thank you, Dean Kushner, she said, her hands clasped together, followed by, Gloria, adios. Adios. But, the dean whipped his glasses from his face and pointed them at Miles. You're fired from the store and the work-study program. I'm sorry, folks, but effective immediately, your room and board voucher has been rescinded. The post-meeting walk was a silent one, just the sound of hard soles and high heels clacking against the pavement. Once they all got to the car, Miles's father got in the driver's seat. We'll talk about this later, he said in a gruff tone, then closed the door. Miles's mother gave him a cold hug. I'm sorry, I didn't mean for... Miles's voice began to crack. His mother didn't respond. She just tightened her lips like she had something to say, then released them. I guess I'll see you this weekend, he said, low, as she climbed in the passenger side. Miles caught the tail end of Miss Blaffis's class. He handed her his pass and took his seat. Where were you? Yankee whispered in Miles' ear. Miles didn't say anything, just shook his head. Miles, we're sorry you missed the fabulous poems about family, Miss Blaffis said. But just to catch you up, the homework assignment tonight has to do with even more family exploration. I want you to either call your parents or search online for the meaning of your name. Great. If there was one thing Miles didn't want to do, it was call his parents. About anything. Miss Blaffis fiddled with the plastic bracelets on her wrist and continued. It can be your first name, your middle name, your last name. It doesn't matter. And if you can't find any actual meaning, then ask your folks why they named you what they did. Then write a CJO on your findings. Got it? Miles offered a slight nod, still reeling from what had just happened in Dean Kushner's office. He sucked his lips into his mouth and pinched them down. He felt like he wanted to cry or scream. The bell rang. Bro, where were you? Yankee asked. I needed you to talk me off the freaking ledge. Everyone was talking about how much they love family. And I mean, I love mine too, but, people were talking about their dads the same way they talk about their dogs. And all I kept thinking was, where the hell's Miles? Kushner's office with my folks. Miles hadn't even taken anything out of his backpack, so he just threw it over his shoulder and watched Alicia walk out of the room without even looking back at him. With your parents? Yeah, I'll tell you about it later. Miles grumbled, now moving through the grid of desks. Wait, you're not coming to lunch? Nah, I'm not hungry. I think I'm just going to go sit in the library until it's time for Chamberlain's class. Yankee didn't even try to fight Miles on that one, just gave him a high five and walked away. Miles ghosted down the hall in a total head funk, his fellow classmates zipping by him as blurs of pink and peach and occasional brown, like Judge, who extended his hand to Miles as he approached. Miles, by sheer muscle memory, gave Judge a five as he sounded off about the Halloween party. Yankee said you fine gonna come, Judge said in the words sort of floating around Miles' ears, but not actually entering. Miles was too busy thinking about who his parents might have been talking about. Do you think our son is a thief? He said he didn't do it, but do you believe him? I mean, did you tell the truth when you were stealing? Sausage in a can? Where was Yankee? An open mic? We didn't send him there to be a rapper. How are we going to pay for his room and board? How are we going to pay for his room and board? How are we going to pay for his room and board? He pushed open the door to the library and exhaled in silence of the space. Brooklyn Visions Academy's library was like a sanctuary. It was collegiate, full of fancy lamps and tables, ornate designs, and the crown molding lining in the ceiling and doors. This was a library where Shakespeare and all the rest of the dead white guys Miles had to study in the school would have wanted to have their ashes scattered. Under the cherrywood floorboards or mixed into the polish of the oak tables. At this hour, everyone was either in class or at lunch, so Miles had the place all to himself, minus the librarian, Mrs. Tripley, or as she was known around campus, Trippin' Tripley. Mrs. Tripley, who was everyone, Mrs. Tripley, who was everyone expected Miss Bluffus to become in 30 years. An old lady, full of life, so happy, so curious that it seemed weird. Careful, Miles, said Mrs. Tripley, as Miles walked through the door. Mrs. Tripley knew everyone's name, every student, every teacher. Careful of what? Miles said, staring up at her. Looks like you're the one who should be careful. Ah, famous last words, she said, twisting the bulb under the light flickered. She said, twisting the light bulb until the light flickered on. I just didn't want you to walk under this ladder, is all. Miles smirked. Mrs. Tripley, I don't mean no harm, but why would I do that? I have no idea, son, but people do it. And let me tell you, it's bad luck. I don't need to walk under a ladder to have that. What's that? She asked. Nothing. It's just, you believe in that stuff? What, superstitions? She stepped gingerly down each rung of the ladder. I don't know. I think they're interesting, and we can't prove what we can't prove, huh? Miles had no idea what that meant, or if it meant anything at all. Mrs. Tripley continued. But whether you believe in them or not, you still shouldn't walk under a ladder, because somebody like me might fall on you, and that, my dear, is bad luck. She held the round bulb to her ear and shook the burnt filament around inside. Trust me, been there. Miles opened his mouth to ask, but then decided against it. Now what can I do for you? Mrs. Tripley left the ladder in the middle of the floor and walked over to the trash can behind her desk, which was also big and wooden. Hide me? Hide you? Mrs. Tripley slapped her hands together to clear the dust from her fingers. Are you being sought after? Are you that creature Frankenstein is chasing? Are you the young Bill Sikes being hunted by a mob of Jacob's Island? Are you Ralph running from the spears of the other stranded kids? Hmm. Um, Miles. I know who you are, Miles, and that was Shelley Dickens. That was Shelley, Dickens, and Golding. You, my dear, should spend more time in the library. It's not just a hiding place, but also a place where the chases happen. Understand? I guess so. Miles didn't know what to say or how to even respond to Trippin' Tripley, and was regretting coming into the library at all. Yankee was probably scarfing down pizza while Miles was trying to decode the school librarian. Now, on a second note, you're not really being chased, are you? She leaned in case the chaser was in the building. No, I'm fine. What he really wanted to say was, I don't know. Okay, phew, that's good. She knocked on the desk. Knock on wood, Miles. I don't. Just do it. Miles knocked. Does anyone know where that superstition came from? She grabbed the pile of books from a cart beside her desk and started towards the stacks. Miles followed behind. Well, I don't know if anyone does, but I do, Mrs. Tripley quipped. See, in ancient times it was believed that good spirits lived in trees, and that when you knocked on them, you were calling on them to come and protect you. Then, while slipping a book onto the shelf, she added, I'll even do you one better. You know why people say you get 7 years of bad luck if you break a mirror? Because souls are trapped in mirrors. And when you break a mirror, you let them out. She threw her hands in the air emphatically. I mean, I don't really believe that. And honestly, I don't know why 7 is a number of bad luck years. But that's where it comes from. Any other questions? Yeah, Miles said. You know anything about white cats? Other than they're adorable? Nope. Nothing? You said white cats, right? Miles nodded. Yeah. I got nothing. What about spiders? They're scary, Mrs. Tripley said bluntly, while squeezing another book into an already stuffed row. But I mean, do you know any superstitions about them? Mrs. Tripley stopped between two bookshelves, turned to Miles. I do know one thing. It used to be said that spiders could connect the past with the future. Something about the symbolism of the web. You serious? Of course. She resumed restocking. How you even know all this? Oh, Miles, because I live here. She caught herself. I mean, I don't live here. I mean, look, sometimes I take a nap in the geography section, pretend I'm in Thailand, and wake up in the morning, but that doesn't count as living here, so don't think that. But I live in the books. I read and read all the heavy stuff, waiting for the day to come when one of my students, like you, comes in to ask me about spiders. She checked her watch. Now, if I were you, I'd get to class. What time is it? The first bell rang 2 minutes ago. But I didn't hear it. Well, the light bulbs aren't the only thing that blow out in this old place. She winked. Oh no. Oh no. Miles couldn't be late for Chamberlain's class. If there was any class he couldn't be late to, it was that one. He dashed through he dashed back through stacks and barreled through the library door. The hallway wasn't packed, which wasn't a good sign because it meant the second bell would be ringing any moment. Miles broke out into a full-on sprint down the hall, rocketing into Mr. Chamberlain's class, sweating and out of breath. Made it, he spat out. Mr. Chamberlain didn't even acknowledge him. He was scribbling his daily quote over the faint outline of the quote that he'd written for the class before. When Miles got to his seat, Mr. Chamberlain began to chant for the day. All we ask, he said softly, is to be left alone. He set the chalk in the chalk tray and pressed his hands together, meditatively, as the last few stragglers, including Hope Feinstein and Alicia, entered the room. The bell rang, which apparently was also a signal for Alicia to turn on her cold shoulder, because she did. And like clockwork, the buzzing in Miles' head started up. Miles opened his mouth to speak to Alicia, but the words disintegrated like snow that melts before it hits the ground. He tried again, but was cut off by Mr. Chamberlain. All we ask is to be let alone, Chamberlain repeated a little louder. Miles took that as a sign to let Alicia alone. Mr. Chamberlain repeated it a third time and then asked, Do you know who said that? Yeah, Brad Canby said, slouched at the desk. Everybody in his class. Many of the students laughed, some even being obnoxious enough to bang on the desk as they howled. Miles didn't even crack a smile. He couldn't afford to, literally. For a moment, his mind drifted. He thought about what Tripley said about spiders representing the connection between the past and the future, and wished he could somehow apply that to getting his job back, taking the past firing and connecting it to a future of reemployment. Maybe I could just beg Dean Cushing. Maybe I could ask to be put on probation and given a chance to prove myself. I mean, I'm basically a straight A student. That's gotta count for something, right? No, Mr. Canby, Mr. Chamberlain said, totally ignoring the disrespect. Actually, it was Jefferson Davis. Maybe I could. Wait, what? And a cloud in Miles's mind instantly vanished at the sound of his father's name. Jefferson Davis? Buzz. Then Miles said it out loud. Jefferson Davis? Managing his nausea was starting to become normal. He knew he wouldn't die. It would just feel like death, like panic, like his brain was held over a flame and his stomach was in a spin cycle. Spidey sense ignored. Mr. Chamberlain opened his eyes. Morales, have you forgotten about classroom decorum? Raise your hand if you want to speak. Again, Miles stared into his eyes. But Brad didn't. Miles closed his mouth, fuming. There was no use. Alicia shifted in her seat as Mr. Chamberlain continued. And yes, Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy during the American Civil War, the man who appointed Robert E. Lee General of the Army of the Northern Virginia to lead the most important Confederate army. Mr. Chamberlain closed his eyes again. The quote is a simple one, but it means so much. It's simply asking that the people of the South be allowed to govern themselves, that the way things were going were just fine. Unless you were a slave, Brad blurted out, rolling his eyes. Seriously, Alicia said under her breath. Chamberlain opened his eyes for a moment and shot her a glare, but he didn't say anything, just burned Alicia with his eyes, then snapped them shut again, took a deep, annoyed breath, and with his hands still pressed together, without any finger wagging or scolding, he replied to Brad, "Well, Mr. Canby, it's a bit more complicated than that." While Alicia shook her head every few minutes, flustered by Mr. Chamberlain's words, Miles drifted in and out of the lecture, not only dealing with the sandalwood leaping from the back of Alicia's neck, but also the fact that his father's name was the same name as the man who was fighting to keep slavery alive. And Chamberlain kept the Jefferson Davis quotes coming. Wherever there is an immediate connection between a master and slave, whatever is of the harshness of in the system is diminished. As he preached from the front of the class to the 2 or 3 students scribbling in their notebooks and about 15 others who were listening to music, playing on their phones, or like Brad Canby, had their heads on their desks asleep. But Miles was neither writing nor sleeping. Instead, he's sitting there, letting every word dagger through his mind. We underestimate the bond between a slave and a master. So many slaves were comfortable with being enslaved, happy even. Later this week, maybe I'll bring in some images to better illustrate my point. Images? Again, Alicia sparked up. No disrespect, Mr. Chamberlain, but don't you think that's, I don't know, taking a bit far to illustrate your point? Chamberlain didn't budge. Alicia looked around the room for a supportive face, but most people had already checked out. She turned and glanced back at Miles, and he was staring down at the fake wood again. Fake wood grain on his desk, fighting to keep. Are you serious? Trapped behind his lips. Too much going on, too much at once. The buzzing was now burning, the heat of frustration spreading throughout his body. But Miles just tapped his fingers on his desk, trying his best to keep his composure. He continued to sit, quietly stewing, as Mr. Chamberlain dug his heels into this ridiculous lecture. Miles wondered if at this point Chamberlain's Civil War lesson was all just a bait fail, because no one cared enough to engage except Brad, who was just playing around, and Alicia, who was simply ignored. But Chamberlain kept pushing. This is getting intense. An interesting way to understand this is to think about dogs. Dogs don't mind being on leashes, being in cages. Mr. Chamberlain, in a rare instance, broke his statue-like stance, removed his blazer, and set it on his desk in the corner of the room. Then he unbuttoned his cuffs and flipped them so his wrists were exposed. And that's where Miles saw it, the dark outline of a cat on his left wrist. A tattoo he had seen other times but paid no attention to because Mr. Chamberlain was weird enough to have a tattoo of a cat on his wrist. The type of guy who had pet cats with complicated historical names, which he pretended were his children. That guy. But this tattoo was familiar. It wasn't an actual image of a cat. It was a symbol. A cat with a bunch of tails, like the cat Miles had dreamed about the night before. Chamberlain took a step forward and placed his eyes right on Miles again. And every time the dog sees their owner, the people who put the leashes around their happy necks and feed them scraps, they wag their tails, happy. Some would even say grateful. Grateful? Miles wasn't sure his brain had gone static, but he could have sworn Alicia had said that out loud at the exact same time he was thinking it. Grateful? And if she had said it, which judging by Chamberlain's brief pause and pinched lips, she had. Chamberlain again paid Alicia no mind. No reply. But that word, combined with a tattoo on Chamberlain's wrist and a buzzing inside of Miles, was enough to spark a light to light a fuse in him. Miles' tapping fingers suddenly became a clenched fist. He raised it, slammed it down on the desk, splitting the wood and buckling the metal legs. Everyone jumped, including Alicia, who whipped around to see what had happened. Miles looked into her eyes, his chest heaving. "I'm sorry," he said softly. Then to Mr. Chamberlain, "I'm sorry." "You should be," Mr. Chamberlain snapped, but he didn't seem startled by it at all, as if he was expecting it. He took another step closer. "It would be in your best interest to put a muzzle on this anger of yours, Morales." "A muzzle?" Miles jumped from his seat. His desk crunched up in front of him. Luckily for him, at the very moment the bell rang. Still with a closed fist, Miles looked around at his classmates, everyone wide awake, looking on with their mouths hanging open. They slowly grabbed their bags under the heat of his gaze, as if they could be crunched up next. Miles eased his glare, collapsed his chest, collected his things as quickly as possible, and left. As he tore through the hallway, Miles heard Alicia calling for him, over his internal voice yelling, "Stupid, stupid, stupid, stupid." But he just kept moving, juking through the mob of students, some already whispering about what had just happened moments before in class. Information moves faster in high school hallways than it does even on the internet. So Miles had to move twice as fast. "Miles!" Alicia shouted again. But Miles put on his head down and just charged on. "Miles, wait!" Alicia followed Miles to the end of the corridor. "Just stop for 1 second," she said, finally close enough for him to touch his shoulder. Close enough to him to touch his shoulder. Miles turned around, his face tight and flushed, his chest heaving, his hands still trembling. "It's over for me. I'm out of here." Alicia caught her breath. "Look, I just wanted to say what happened in class today was, we gotta do something." "Do something? Do what?" Miles shot back. "You want to have a little poetry reading about it? You think that's going to help me?" The words came out with the sharp edges, prickly, and Miles regretted them as soon as they left his mouth. "Help you?" Alicia's face nodded. "You think this is about you, Miles?" She shook her head and sort of laughed, but not in a ha-ha kind of way. "This ain't about you. This is about us. And not just you and me, but about Winnie and Judge and all the freshmen and the sophomores who are going to have to take this class, the seniors who have already had it, the kids coming into the school. And if Chamberlain is acting like this, if he's talking like this, you think he's the only one? And you think you are the student he's picked on?" Alicia crossed her arms. "Maybe a little poetry reading won't do much, but let me ask you about something, Miles. What are you going to do?" That's not what I meant," Miles said. "All I'm saying is, what can I do? You you just don't know. I smashed the desk." Miles caught himself. I just pounded it, and it broke up like that. But the point is, they're probably about to kick me out because of it. So at this point, it don't really matter what I do." "Oh, okay, I see," Alicia said sarcastically. "I don't know, huh? Well, let me tell you what I do know. You scared." Miles opened his mouth to say something, but Alicia put her hand up, stopped him. "No, no, it's okay. I understand. I don't blame you for being scared, because you are. You're just not going to do nothing, right? Just going to take your defeat because that's better, right?" "Alicia," Miles started, but he had nothing, no answers, no way to explain everything. Well, let me know how all that goes for you, Miles," she said, turning away and walking away. Stupid, stupid, stupid. Woo! All right, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, that was an intense chapter. What do you think? Hmm. All right, chapter 7 coming up soon. Hopefully, I won't keep you waiting too long. Um, this is getting good. This is getting good. All right, boys and girls. Until next time, peace out.